This is Speaking of the Arts, Mid-Missouri's only in-depth weekly art show, recorded in the heart of the Midwest, Columbia, Missouri, and broadcast each Friday morning from 10 till 11 on 89.5 FM, KOPN Columbia. My name is Diana Moxon. I confess I have next to zero interest in the history of the British monarchy. I know it's my country and all that, but it always felt just like a list of dates and battles and bloody beheadings. Yes, Henry VIII was a bit of a scallywag, and we all learned the mnemonic for his wives: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And his daughter, Elizabeth I, did a lot of conquering and plundering. Then there was mean old Richard III, who locked his two nephews in the Tower and probably murdered them. But beyond that, it all feels rather dry and unappealing. But those medieval kings were great fodder for Shakespeare, whose set of 4 plays, Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, and Henry V, were all written around 200 years after their reigns. And Henry V, in which a young prince matures into a king and then wages war on France, opens at Maplewood Barn on July the 8th, but with a twist. And here to tell us why its tale of insult, treason, the march to war and surprising victory are still relevant to us today are the play's director, Dana Bocke, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Mark Baumgartner. Good morning, Dana and Mark.
Hello.
Hello.
Now, I know you may not be actually the Archbishop of Canterbury, but we'll get to who Canterbury is in a minute. So I seem to recall reading or being told that Maplewood Barn's 2021 season is all about Missouri. And yet Henry V is about a long-dead English king waging war on the French because he thinks he should be king of their country too. So I know from seeing some promotional photographs that your Henry is decidedly not an English king. So Dana, tell me about your Henry and his motley crew of advisors, traitors, and soldiers.
So yes, when you decide, okay, so the theme is the Missouri Bicentennial, everything needs to either be set in Missouri or by a Missouri playwright or, some connection to Missouri. And then how do you make Shakespeare work in that? And, Shakespeare, the magic of Shakespeare, the reason, one of the reasons I think a lot of theaters still do so much Shakespeare is you can play with it any way you want, and Shakespeare's not here to care. So you can set it in, steampunk 1920s. You can set it in the future. There's so many things you can do. And so I was like, all right, so I need to think about a way that, we can tailor a Shakespeare to Missouri. And as we were discussing it, Nathan, who is my assistant director, was like, you can just, before we hitched our wagons to this insane idea, we were just brainstorming. And he's like, you can just pick one. Just pick one and you set it in Missouri. You don't even have to do anything. I'm like, you can't just do anything. Like, you can't just take Henry V and make it about the Civil War in Missouri. You can't just do that. And then I stopped. I just froze. And he's like, oh no, you're going to do it. And I'm like, shut up. Maybe. And that was, we had that conversation probably a year and a half ago, and I couldn't let the idea go. So when the barn chose Henry V for the season, I applied to direct and I submitted my insane idea and they went for it. So you just take away all the French stuff and the English stuff and just make it about a land war. And, also one of the reasons that Henry V isn't staged a whole lot, there's lots of great movie adaptations, but there aren't a lot of play adaptation. You don't see it on live theater because how do you have these huge battle scenes? How do you have, these immense war scenes in a community theater on a budget? Like, how do you do that? Like, you can't, how do you get the people? So, and doing some more research about the Civil War in Missouri and the kind of fighting that was very prevalent in Missouri was guerrilla warfare. So it was small bands roaming around, causing a lot of trouble. And I was like, if you do that, there's your opposing sides. They don't have to be big battles because that's not a lot of what happened in Missouri. There were big battles, but a lot of it was just small bands roaming around, destroying property and killing each other. And we could absolutely do that. So that's how I kind of took this epic, heroic English warrior king and just made him the leader of a Union guerrilla band in Missouri.
Okay, so Henry is a Unionist,
yes.
And then the French are...
The French are the Confederates, yes.
Okay. So were there any scenes that you really needed to keep from the original play, but were a struggle to translate from 15th century France to 19th century Missouri?
Actually, no. Once, and that's, albeit if you have ever seen Henry V, it is every bit of a 3-hour play. My play is much, much shorter. So I just kept cutting. There is a lot in Henry V that does not track if you haven't also seen Richard II and Henry IV, Part 1 and 2. Falstaff, who is one of the most beloved characters in Shakespeare. I think people love Falstaff, but they mention him, they talk about him. But if you haven't seen Henry IV, then you don't get it. So I did have to cut a lot of stuff that without prior knowledge didn't work. But in the end, there wasn't stuff that I was like, well, I need to keep this, but it's hard to make it work. You just sort of tweak a England to a union here and a France to a, rebellion here. And it wasn't hard to keep stuff. It was easy to cut stuff.
Were there, same kind of question about the characters, were there any essential characters from the original play that were difficult to fit into a Civil War production? I mean, I'm thinking of, Mark is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Mark, I mean, who does Canterbury become in this play?
He's actually just a rich landowner, and they're about to be taxed, and they need the distraction of the war to make everybody forget about the taxation. And so, yeah, I'm pushing Henry into battle so I can keep my wealth. So
there's no godly component about you at all?
Oh, no, there's never a godly component about me.
Dana, was there anybody that you had to cut? I mean, obviously, I think there were 39 characters in the original play, and I think you have, 21 or something, with some people doubling up. Were there any people that you were just like, nah, this doesn't work?
All the women, which upsets me, but not when you decide, okay, Henry can be played by a woman. I don't care. As long as you go in with this idea that you're going to have gender blind casting, it's not as painful. But there are 4 female characters in all of Henry V, and none of them worked for the setting in Missouri. None of them worked for a Civil War setting because 2 or 3 of the main characters that are women, and I say main characters very loosely, are at the end because after Henry wins and the French king is like, oh, you won. Here, have my part of my country and my daughter. Just take her. I mean, that's essentially how it goes. So it ends with a wedding in very Shakespeare fashion. And that there are no weddings that ended the Civil War. That's too neat and too clean. That's very Shakespeare. It's odd that it actually worked in history. So, we threw out all of those female characters, like the princess, her mother, and her attendant, essentially, because we're not going to have a wedding. That's not how our show's going to end. Because even at the end of our show, you very much so get that this is just a pause in hostilities. This isn't really the end of anything.
I wondered about that. I mean, I read that often the 5th act of Henry V is omitted because it feels superfluous and anticlimactic. You have this, yay, big victory, we won the war, and then someone's walking down the aisle and it's an arranged marriage. It doesn't really feel like it fits at the end of the play. So I guess, was that an easy decision to get rid of Act 5?
Yeah, for the most part. I kept Burgundy has this beautiful monologue at the end that basically talks about the evils of war. And he's like, our children are not being educated. The fields are not being tended. We should stop this. I love that monologue. And I love that I got to keep it because, he's trying to convince them to stop fighting. And as far as we know, they do for a little while. So I got to keep a little bit of it. But yeah, it is sort of anticlimactic given the rest of the play. It's very Shakespeare. We're going to end with a wedding, and he doesn't care how out of place that seems. But ours wouldn't work that way.
So Henry V is definitely not a comedy, but there are comedic elements in the play, mostly within the ranks of the soldiers. So Mark, tell me a little bit about how you translated that comedy into your production.
Well, I have to say, I play Canterbury in the first part of the show, and after he leaves the stage, then I transition over and I play a Union soldier named Williams, and then I also play a Confederate soldier at some point. It's a very schizophrenic play for me, but the way we translated our soldiers, it's a little more solemn. I think it's a lot of ruminating on the horrors of war, basically. And so I don't know how funny we are this time around, but I mean, it's a joy to play those characters because it's a lot of Henry is back and forth between these larger than life characters of Henry and, the Southern general. And so to get to play these more down to earth, salt of the earth characters that are caught up in all this is kind of an interesting place to be. I like it.
I mean, again, going back to the Shakespeare play, Llewellyn, who is a Welsh soldier, obviously not a Welsh soldier in your play, but I mean, he has a lot of comedy. Now, you have Ronnie Rossi, so you're doing some gender blind casting on Llewellyn.
Right.
Does he have any comedy, Dana, in this play?
Not really. Ronnie brings comedy to anything if she wants to. So there is a little bit of comedy, but it's very understated. It's not in anything Llewellyn says. It's how Ronnie plays Llewellyn. And there are some bits of comedy, but a lot of it is you have to be watching for it. The problem with Llewellyn and those characters that were part of the comedic relief was, one, not really important to the story. And two, it was all based on like cultural stereotypes that I'm not sure, even if I had kept them, would work. Like I don't know if people would get why it was supposed to be funny the way it was funny 400 years ago. So we took a lot of that kind of humor out, but there's still a lot of these are real people. I tried to make them as real as possible. So the problem with a lot of the Shakespeare histories is that, again, they're these larger than life characters and they kind of become archetypes. And I wanted this to feel real. I wanted the struggle of people in war to be more important than the patriotic messages that Henry sometimes has, particularly for, England, but you could take it anyway. And I wanted it to be, and so my favorite scene probably in the whole show is between Williams, who Mark plays, Bates, and Henry, when Henry disguises himself and decides to walk out amongst his soldiers and see what mood everybody's in, because they are outnumbered, they are tired, and they are facing a huge battle. And the three of them just sit and they talk, and I think it's the most real part of the play, and I love it. I love how it's still very relatable. I love how the language still somehow lends itself to more of a country Southern twang. Like it absolutely works, even though it's complete Shakespeare. It's beautiful. And that scene starts out with Mark singing. We've worked some traditional Civil War songs into the show, which is another thing that I love you can do with Shakespeare. And so that scene starts pretty much with Mark and Corey singing a traditional Civil War ballad.
In terms of the language, I mean, you're using original Shakespeare language. Have you adapted the play linguistically at all to reflect dialogue of the Ozark area?
No. I mean, we changed like specific names, specific titles. There's no references to King Henry. It's just Henry. Like everybody's titles became their last names. But no, I didn't change anything in terms of like a local dialect. And yet somehow it works. And it's just incredibly entertaining to see how well it did.
Mark, did you know the premise for it when you auditioned, that it was going to be set during the Civil War?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, then that's kind of what was exciting, like to be able to do Shakespeare and not have to do a British accent was very intriguing.
I'm so glad. I was so glad. I thought, oh God, don't let them do British accents.
No, it was great. And Dana told us from the beginning, she was like, now I don't want anybody coming in and doing this with it either. And so when I'm doing she was talking about that scene when we're sitting on the log, I started out and I did a little bit of this, and then I just kept going, seeing how far she'd let me go. And she never stopped me, so I found the place where I was comfortable. That's